Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to week 5. So we're in our last component of informal fallacies here. Also being in week 5, we're in the home stretch, just a few weeks left in class after that. So we're almost there. So let's begin here with 3-4, fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and illicit transference. So these are all in 3-4, but there are three subgroupings within 3-4. So let's start with fallacies of presumption first. So all fallacies of presumption assume that which is needed to be proven. So in other words, they don't, all arguments that commit these forms of informal fallacies don't actually have the evidence necessary to support the provided conclusion, and they just do it in various ways. So the first one here is the fallacy of begging the question. It's committed whenever the arguer creates the illusion that inadequate premises provide adequate support for the conclusion. And this can happen in a number of different ways. There could be just a missing premise, for example, some bit of evidence is just left out. It could be that the premise and the conclusion, the premises and the conclusion essentially state the same thing, but just using different phraseology or different terminology, so really no arguments being offered. Or it could be that the argument is just a chain of reasoning that ends up back where it started, so it's just sort of a giant circular argument. And in fact, essentially all forms of begging the question fallacy commit circular reasoning. So sometimes begging the question is sometimes referred to as circular reasoning. So let's think about some examples here. Good example of obviously circular reasoning that involves long chains or steps would be something like this. Imagine if a student is in a philosophy class and they're discussing the issue of the existence of God. The professor asks the student, well, how do you know that God exists? And the student says, well, because the Bible says so. And then the professor asks, well, how do you know the Bible's true? And then the student says, well, the Bible's the Word of God. It must be true. So clearly that argument is circular, because in order for the Bible to be the valid Word of God, you'd have to know that God exists. And that was the question in the very beginning. What evidence would you have for the existence of God? So nowhere in that argument does the student actually prove what's needed in order to support the conclusion that God exists. So it's just a large circle. So sometimes arguers can disguise an implausible and fallacious argument by making it a very complex series of steps, and those steps actually just end up back where the arguer started. Another example begging the question that involves restating the premise in a different form of the conclusion would be something like abortion is morally wrong because it's ethically unacceptable to terminate the life of a fetus. Right? So the conclusion is abortion is morally wrong, and then the premise is it's ethically unacceptable to terminate the life of a fetus. It sounds like there's an argument there. The premise is it's ethically unacceptable to terminate the life of a fetus. The conclusion is therefore abortion is morally wrong. But if you look at those two statements, they say exactly the same thing, just using different words. Saying that abortion is morally wrong is exactly the same thing as saying it's ethically unacceptable to terminate the life of a fetus. So begging the question is a common fallacy, and can be very subtle and difficult to spot sometimes. But when you're reading a passage and you start to get the sense that the same thing is being said in different ways, or you feel like you're ending up back where you started in the reasoning of the argument, then you're likely dealing with the fallacy of begging the question. Okay, so next fallacy of presumption is complex question. So this fallacy is committed when two or more questions are asked in the guise of a single question, and a single answer is then given to both of them. So this is the kind of fallacy that might occur in a courtroom or some kind of formal questioning process. Imagine that someone's asking a student about cheating on exams, and they phrase the question this way: okay, Billy, have you stopped cheating on exams? And so if Billy says, no, I haven't stopped cheating on exams, then that means he's still cheating. If he says yes, it means he previously was cheating but no longer is. So no matter how he answers yes or no, he ends up being guilty of cheating on the exams. So what's really going on there is there are two questions. Did you ever cheat on exams? And are you still cheating on exams? Sometimes you'll see attorneys, for example, ask people giving testimony to limit their answers to yes or no questions, and then they pose them with a complex question of the kind of example I just used, and sort of trap them into admitting something that they might not actually be wanting to admit. So this is a pretty easy fallacy to spot. It'll always be phrased in the form of a question, and so if you see a question, you need to ask yourself, is this question actually a disguised form of multiple questions? If it is, then you're dealing with a fallacy of complex question. And then there's false dichotomy. So a dichotomy is just an either-or statement. This fallacy is committed when a disjunctive, that's an either-or statement, when a disjunctive premise presents two unlikely alternatives as if they were the only ones available, and the arguer then eliminates the undesirable alternative, leaving the desirable one as a conclusion. So if someone said something like, well, you either want to vote Republican this next presidential election, or the economy will collapse. Clearly you don't want the economy to collapse. It'll negatively affect you. Therefore, vote Republican. That'd be a good example of false dichotomy, because there are other options. You could vote for the Democratic Party, and the economy would probably be basically the same as if the Republicans were in the White House. If you wanted to vote for the Green Party or the independent ticket, it would probably still be essentially the same economy. The economy is kind of an independent entity from the government. The government has only limited control of what happens in the economy. So that's just sort of a scare tactic fallacy. Either this or this. This is a terrible thing, therefore you must accept this other thing. Patently bad reasoning. Now, this one's fairly easy to spot in everyday discourse too. If somebody offers you a disjunction, an either or you have two options, your logical radar detector should come on, and you should ask yourself, of these two options that I'm being offered, are these legitimately the only two options? If there are more options available, then probably it's the fallacy of false dichotomy. Then we have suppressed evidence. This fallacy occurs when in an inductive argument the arguer ignores important evidence that outweighs the presented evidence and entails a very different conclusion. So this could be a little hard to spot in passages, but the fallacy itself is not very complex. All that's going on here is some bit of evidence that's important is being left out. Imagine you're at a car dealership and you're considering buying a used car, and the car salesperson says, this car is a great deal. It's got a really shiny paint job, and the interior is in nice condition, and the tires are brand new. So it's clearly worth the price tag of $10,000 or something. But what the salesperson is failing to tell you is that the previous owner never changed the oil. The dealership turned the odometer back, so the odometer reading is not accurate. And they hit on the starter with a hammer, so it would start when people came to purchase the car. So there are these hidden factors that affect the value of the car that aren't being conveyed to the customer. And so the salesperson is trying to convince you that it's a good idea. They're making the argument that it's a good idea to buy the car, but they're doing it based on incomplete evidence. So they're suppressing important evidence for your decision. So that'd be a good example of the fallacy of suppressed evidence. Okay, so then we have the second grouping here, fallacies of ambiguity. And these all rely upon shifts in meaning between the premises and the conclusion. So some terminology is subtly shifting its meaning between the premises and the conclusion. And in any argument, if you establish the meaning of a term for the argument to genuinely support the conclusion, you have to continue to use the meaning of the term in exactly the same way throughout the reasoning pattern. So fallacies of ambiguity don't do that, and so they commit a fallacy in exactly that way by changing the meaning very subtly usually. So it's not an obvious change, it's just a very subtle change. So we have equivocation here. So with the word equivocate means to just present something in two different ways, a word with two different meanings, for example. So this fallacy occurs when the conclusion of an argument depends on the fact that a word or phrase is used either explicitly or implicitly in two different senses in the argument. So imagine a simple argument like all factories are plants, all plants contain chlorophyll, therefore all factories contain chlorophyll. Something's gone wrong in the argument. So in the first premise I say all factories are plants, so the word plant in the first premise refers to a place where you manufacture something. And then the second premise I say all plants contain chlorophyll. Now we're using plant in a different way. We're talking about living things that convert sunlight and water and carbon into carbohydrates. And so the word plant is being equivocated on. In the first premise, it refers to a place where you manufacture something. In the second premise, it refers to a living thing that performs photosynthesis. So since the meaning of the word has changed, you get this weird conclusion, therefore all factories contain chlorophyll, which is obviously unjustified. So equivocation, all you're looking for is a change in the meaning of a word very subtly throughout the reasoning pattern of an argument. Then we have amphibole, which is kind of a fancy word, but amphibole just basically means a grammatical structure that can have multiple interpretations. So in this fallacy is committed when the arguer misinterprets ambiguous statement and then draws a conclusion based on this faulty interpretation. So ambiguous statement means a statement that can be interpreted in more than one way. So this fallacy usually occurs because of grammatical structural arrangements that make a statement unclear. So for example, if I said something like standing on the Broadway Bridge in North Little Rock, you can see the very peak of Pinnacle Mountain. Therefore I draw the conclusion Pinnacle Mountain is located on the Broadway Bridge in North Little Rock. Now that sounds weird, but realize that for a statement standing on the Broadway Bridge in North Little Rock, you can see the very peak of Pinnacle Mountain. That could mean either you standing on the bridge in North Little Rock and looking at Pinnacle Mountain in the distance, or it could be interpreted to mean Pinnacle Mountain itself is standing on the bridge. And so we obviously know from our experience that Pinnacle Mountain is not on the bridge in North Little Rock, but what happens with amphibole is an arguer uses that ambiguous statement and then draws the unwarranted conclusion on purpose. So that's sort of a stark example I've given you, kind of a weird example, but in everyday life people can restructure language in such a way to where there's enough ambiguity where they can seemingly support a conclusion when in fact they're not doing so. If they're doing that because of a ambiguous statement as a result of structural arrangements in a statement or inside an argument, then it's probably the fallacy of amphiboly. So then we have this other grouping, third grouping here, fallacies of illicit transference. These fallacies rely upon a deceptive similarity in linguistic structure. So what that means is they look structurally like they are compelling arguments. In other words, there are arguments that have that same basic structure that are very, very convincing. And so since they have the structure of a convincing argument, they are able to convince someone. The argument itself seems to be compellingly convincing. So first one here is composition, fallacy of composition. So this fallacy is committed when the conclusion of an argument depends on the erroneous transfer of an attribute from the parts to the whole. So remember, composition always goes from part to whole. Composition means you're putting together. So in the fallacy of composition, you're going from part to whole, putting something together. So usually what happens is somebody will argue that the parts have some property, therefore the whole must have some property. So there are lots of easy examples to come up with using elements from the periodic table. So what if we said something like, clearly sodium is poisonous, clearly chlorine is poisonous, so sodium and chlorine combined together are clearly poisonous. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Yes, sodium is poisonous, very toxic, chlorine is very toxic, but if you put sodium and chlorine together in the right ratios, you end up with table salt. And as long as you don't eat an excessive amount of it, it's not poisonous. In fact, it's something we use to enhance the flavor of our foods. So that'd be a good example of the fallacy of composition. You're taking some properties of the parts, and then you're trying to take those properties and apply them to the whole. Another example would be, Susan likes olives, and Susan likes cereal. Therefore, Susan would like olives combined with her cereal. Right? It just doesn't follow. She might like the individual foods, but combined together, that they have a very different taste. So those would be examples of the fallacy of composition. Then we have division, which is going in the opposite direction from composition. So this fallacy is the exact reverse of composition. As composition goes from parts to whole, division goes from whole to parts. So remember, in division, you're dividing. So you're starting with a whole, and you're breaking it into parts. That's what division means, dividing into component parts. So we can do the same thing with sodium and chlorine again. So clearly, sodium and chlorine combined are not poisonous. It's just table salt. Therefore, if we separate sodium and chlorine together from one another, then they're not toxic either. So it just doesn't work that way, right? So we know, as I said in the previous example, sodium and chlorine are poisonous if they're separated, but they're not poisonous if they're combined together in the right ratios. So division and composition are pretty easy to spot, but what people will often do is confuse them. They'll identify a fallacy of composition as division or division as composition. So just keep in mind what's going on here. In composition, you're going from part to whole, you're composing, and in division, you're going from whole to part. You are taking a whole and breaking it into its component parts, or dividing it into its component parts. Okay, so I just want to make a few comments about fallacies in ordinary language. We've been looking at these fallacies in a fairly artificial environment. I give you some clear examples of fallacies. I tell you that each passage commits a fallacy, and then you're asked to identify the correct fallacy. But fallacies in ordinary language occur in very complex and sometimes difficult to detect ways. So, just being aware of the fact that these fallacies exist already puts you ahead of the game. Most people aren't even aware of these sorts of logical errors. And so, that's one reason in a logic class of this sort, we go through and look at all these different informal fallacies, because they are common patterns of errors in reasoning. And so it's important that, if you're going to be good at logical reasoning, that you are aware of such common errors. So informal fallacies that we've addressed here have been clear-cut, easily recognizable instances of specific mistakes. As I said a minute ago, when fallacies occur in ordinary language, they're rarely clear-cut or easily recognizable. So there are many, many ways of making mistakes and arguing in variations upon those mistakes. So let's look at, sorry, my slides here. So let's look at some of the reasons why fallacies actually occur. So avoiding fallacies, there's no single, simple, straightforward reasons to why people commit fallacies. Some people do them intentionally. I use this as one of your discussion questions or extra credit questions, where I asked you whether it was ethical for somebody to intentionally commit fallacies to convince somebody of a particular conclusion. All of you said that it wasn't ethical, by the way. So what's going on here is arguers often know full well that their reasoning is defective. Might be a politician or attorney or something like that, but they do it anyway because of the perceived and perhaps real benefits for themselves or others. So the idea is, if you're a politician and you want to get elected, if you can use bad logic to convince somebody of an implausible conclusion and it gets you elected, then it benefits you. So person not being intellectually honest in that case, and so they're using fallacies as a tool to trick other people, dupe other people into accepting certain beliefs. Then you just have mental carelessness. Sometimes people are just lazy and not careful, or emotionally influenced in various ways. So this happens when arguers have emotional reasons to favor or oppose some person or thing. They know better, but they allow their feelings to overrule their intellect. So if a politician, for example, just has a really powerful personality, they can say all kinds of fallacious and false things, and because the person likes that individual or is attracted to their personality, they just don't pick up on or don't critically analyze what the individual is saying. This happens all the time when we see political speeches, and particularly when you have political speeches in front of large groups of people. And then finally, the one that's most common here is influence of worldview. This is the one I think I see most often when I'm teaching logic classes and introduction to philosophy classes. So this worldview thing determines how we apprise the world and in which we live, and shapes what we find reasonable or not to believe. So we're all born into the world at a particular time, at a particular place. We're influenced by the beliefs of others. Think of it as being conditioned by our experiences from childhood. And so when we come to a critical thinking scenario and we're going to evaluate an argument, we have all that previous conditioning behind us, and that can affect the way we evaluate arguments. So to be a critical thinker, you have to learn how to step back from your biases and worldviews as best you can. It's almost impossible to completely do it, but just being aware of the fact that you're trying to do it can be beneficial. And so you try to step back from your biases and your worldview and look at things from the perspectives of others, and then you might find that you're actually making some reasoning mistakes, or somebody else is making reasoning mistakes and trying to present them as a plausible argument. And so that's the whole point generally of a course of this type, and particularly going through all these various fallacies, is just to make the critical thinker aware of how biases and conditioning and previous bad reasoning can make one accept implausible conclusions. Okay, so that finishes Chapter 3 material for us, and that moves us outside of informal fallacies. We're moving on in week 6 to categorical propositions, and then in week 7 to categorical syllogisms. That stuff will be a little bit complex, and we'll have to do it step by step, but everybody's doing fine in the class, and it shouldn't be too much of a challenge for you guys. Okay, see you next week, and good luck on the material in 3.4 and 3.5.